The rain over Havenwood wasn't a downpour, it was a tireless, insidious drizzle that seemed to dissolve the streetlights into sickly yellow pools. Detective Miles Kincaid watched the drops spiderweb across his office window, a man whose 42 years had been etched onto his face less by time and more by the things he'd seen under the neon glare of late-night calls. He was known as the anchor at the 14th Precinct, solid, heavy, and holding the line when everything else wanted to drift into chaos. His partner, Detective Sarah Sidney, was across the desk, meticulously cleaning the lenses of her glasses with a microfiber cloth. Sid was younger, sharp, and carried the kind of quiet intensity that often unnerved suspects more than Miles's world-weary stare. "Another dead end on the Carver case," Sid said, sighing as she settled the frames back on her nose. "Kid goes missing from a secured lot, no witnesses, no struggle, just a perfect, clean void where he used to be. The only thing we have is the smell." Miles didn't need to be reminded of the smell. It was metallic and sweet, like copper mixed with rotten plums, clinging to the air around the boy's empty truck. It was a smell that had no logical place in a missing persons file. "The smell is what bothers me, Sid. It's not ozone from a storm and it's not decay," Miles muttered, tapping his pen against a manila folder marked "Open Carver." "It's manufactured. Like someone opened a very old, very heavy door that hadn't been touched in 100 years. The internal phone line buzzed, a short, urgent chirp. Miles picked up. "Kincaid." The voice on the other end belonged to dispatcher Elena Velez, usually cool and unflappable, but now laced with a brittle edge. "Detective, we have a code 8 to 71. Priority 1. Off book." A code 8 to 71 was the precinct's internal designation for a situation involving high-level threat and potential supernatural elements, a term reserved for the kind of bizarre, impossible calls that officially didn't exist in the police manual. It was the internal whispered truth of police work, the Black Dispatch. "Location?" Miles asked, his hand instinctively gripping the worn handle of his service weapon, a gesture he hadn't made for a routine call in years. "The old Havenwood lighthouse, Miles. The one that hasn't been active since '95. The caller is a civilian named Elias Thorne. He didn't use 911. He used the emergency line directly connected to the captain's private office. He sounds terrified talking about the light and the geometry." Sid was already standing, reaching for her jacket. "Geometry? At a lighthouse?" Miles met her gaze. "Put the Carver file on hold. Grab the special kit. We're taking the unmarked." 10 minutes later, the unmarked Crown Victoria was slicing through the coastal fog on the winding road out to the old lighthouse. The air here was colder, heavier, smelling of salt and something else. Something sharp and electric that prickled the hairs on Miles's neck. "Thorne is a local recluse," Sid stated, reading the sparse bio on her tablet. "Lives in a shack half a mile from the light. Writes obscure history books on local architecture. Seems harmless." "Harmless men don't get the captain's private line," Miles countered. "And they don't use words like geometry when they mean a bunch of vandals." As they rounded the final bend, the structure of the lighthouse emerged from the fog like a concrete specter. It was a thick, squat tower of gray stone, silent and ominous, overlooking a rocky promontory. But it wasn't the tower that drew their attention. Above the sealed, dark lantern room where the massive Fresnel lens had sat inert for decades, a light was on. It wasn't the sweeping, rhythmic white beam of a navigational aid. This light was a static, pulsing dark red, like a massive, cyclopean eye staring directly into the churning black ocean. It didn't illuminate, it seemed to absorb the light around it, casting everything into deeper shadow. Miles pulled the car to a sudden stop. "That light is powered down. It's been derelict for 30 years. No utility lines, no generator." They approached the tower on foot, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the heavy, rhythmic thrumming coming from within the stone structure. The oak door, secured by a heavy chain and padlock, was now wrenched open, the iron hinges bent outward as if they'd been popped by an immense internal pressure. "Someone didn't use bolt cutters," Sid whispered, drawing her weapon. "They used force." Miles pushed the door further open. The air inside hit them like a physical wall, the metallic, sweet, rotten plum smell from the Carver case, magnified 100 times. "It's here, Sid. The smell is here." They entered the circular chamber at the base of the tower. The thick stone walls were damp and slick with condensation. In the center of the dusty concrete floor, under the pulsating red glow filtering down from above, was the caller. Elias Thorne was huddled on his hands and knees, rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently. He was not injured, but his eyes were wide and milky with shock, fixed on a spot on the wall behind Miles. Miles lowered his weapon slightly and stepped toward him. "Mr. Thorne, we're the police. What did you see?" Thorne didn't look at them. He pointed a trembling white finger at the wall. The dispatch," he choked out, his voice a dry rasp. "It's the wrong color. The wrong shape." Miles turned, following Thorne's gaze. The wall was covered in a sprawling black substance, like hardened oil or tar freshly applied. It was not graffiti. It was a drawing. A complex, interlocking pattern of impossible geometry, non-Euclidean shapes that seemed to shift and distort the longer Miles looked at them, creating an overwhelming, dizzying sense of depth where there was only flat stone. It was ugly, repellent, and yet it held an almost hypnotic power. At the very center of the chaotic pattern, a single, perfect symbol was inscribed. A circular badge identical to the Havenwood Police Department crest, but with the central star inverted. "It's a mockery," Sid breathed, her voice tight. "It's our badge." Miles felt a cold dread settle in his gut. This wasn't a crime, it was a message. A declaration. Suddenly, the red light above intensified, and the thrumming within the tower rose to a deafening, harmonic roar. Elias Thorne let out a piercing, animalistic scream and slammed his hands over his ears. Miles saw it then in the corner of his eye. High up on the winding metal staircase that spiraled into the darkness, a shadow moved. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too tall, too thin, too wrong. And it was descending. Upstairs. Miles yelled, shoving Sid towards the stairwell as he raised his weapon and aimed into the pitch-black void above. "Code 8-71 confirmed. Contact dispatch. Tell them the black dispatch is active. We need backup now." The sound of the unknown thing's movement on the metal steps was not the rhythmic clang of boots, but a high-pitched dragging scrape, like a long sharp talon gliding over unpolished steel. The dragging scrape on the steel staircase accelerated, descending from the blackness with unnatural speed. Miles instinctively fired 2 quick shots upward, the muzzle flashes blinding white against the oppressive red glow from the lantern room, the sound echoing savagely in the enclosed stone cylinder. The rounds hit nothing solid. Instead of the metallic clang of impact, there was a thin, high-pitched shatter, like glass breaking in slow motion, followed by a sound that made Miles' stomach lurch. A wet, guttural hiss that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Move!" he roared, tackling Sid just as the rhythmic thrumming peaked. The entire stone tower seemed to shudder. The red light above flared into a brilliant, retina-scorching crimson, and the geometric tar drawing on the wall seemed to swell, the shapes momentarily gaining a terrifying three-dimensionality. In that intense flash, Miles caught a fleeting glimpse of the entity. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was an elongation, a dark silhouette impossibly distended, like a shadow peeled off the wall and stretched thin, its form defined less by mass and more by the absence of light. He saw not eyes, but pinpricks of burning white that instantly evaporated when the light snapped back to its pulsating rhythm. The entity's descent stopped just short of the main floor, arrested by the shock of the gunfire and the sudden light. Miles scrambled back to his feet, weapon leveled. "Hold position, Sid." Back against the wall. Sid, recovering quickly, nodded grimly. Miles looked at Thorne. Elias Thorne, who had been screaming, was now eerily silent. He remained on his hands and knees, but he was completely still. The front of his old tweed jacket was soaked, but not with blood. It was a clear, viscous fluid, and it was pouring from his nose and ears. His eyes, fixed on the black geometry, had glazed over, their pupils dilated to consume the entire iris. He looked less like a victim of trauma and more like a statue that had just sprung a devastating internal leak. "Thorne is unresponsive," Miles confirmed, his focus still split between the casualty and the darkness above. "Stay here, I'm going for the stairs." "Negative, Miles, you don't go up there alone. I am not letting that thing walk away after it." Miles stopped. The scrape was gone. The rhythmic, harmonic thrumming had ceased. The pulsing red light above had dimmed, settling back into its oppressive, sickly glow. The chamber was eerily quiet, save for the wind outside and the wet drip of the fluid from Thorne. They waited for 5 minutes, weapons steady, listening to the absolute silence from the stairwell. Miles cautiously approached the stairs. He checked the first 20 feet of the climb. Nothing. The air was thick with the copper and plum scent, but the entity was gone, absorbed back into the tower's heavy shadows. Clear, Miles said, though he hated the word. He turned his attention back to Thorne. Sid was checking his pulse, her expression defeated. "He's alive technically," she said, pulling her gloves off with a snap. "But he's in a catatonic state. Massive neurological event. Looks like his brain just overflowed." Miles knelt beside the man. Thorne's hand was still pointed at the wall, at the impossible shifting pattern of the black dispatch badge. Miles touched the black substance. It was cold, dry, and granular like powdered iron mixed into the tar. "This drawing is fresh, Sid. Hours old at most. But look at the dust." Miles swept his hand across the concrete floor near the drawing. A heavy layer of silt, undisturbed, covered everything else. Whoever did this, or whatever, came in through a locked door, drew this, and vanished from a derelict lighthouse, leaving the only witness a vegetable. And they powered up a light source that doesn't exist. He stood up, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Velez. Tell her to move the perimeter closer." Before he could dial, a set of high beams cut through the gloom outside, followed by the distinctive whine of a patrol car siren. 2 Havenwood PD units screeched to a stop on the gravel. Out rushed Patrolman Davies and Officer Lee, followed by the towering figure of Sergeant Rex Connell, the 14th Precinct's field supervisor, his face a mask of irritation. "Kincaid, what in God's name is going on?" Connell demanded, surveying the wrenched-open door and the twin muzzle flashes scarring the stone near the stairs. "Code 8-71? The captain nearly blew a gasket. This better be a goddamn good joke." "It's not a joke, Sergeant," Miles said, pointing to Thorne. "Victim is a civilian, catatonic. We had an active contact, non-human, on the stairs. It's gone now." He pointed to the wall. "And this is the calling card." Connell stared at the geometry, his initial skepticism warring with the sheer, undeniable wrongness of the scene. The smell, the light, the catatonic man. His eyes finally landed on the inverted police badge at the center of the drawing. His face went pale. "That symbol," Connell rasped, stepping back. "I've seen it before." Miles and Sid exchanged a look. "Where, Sergeant?" Connell swallowed hard, running a hand over the back of his neck. 5 years ago. Before you transferred here, Miles. A cold case. A rookie named Officer Julian Hayes. Walked into the precinct on a late shift, signed out a patrol car, and was found 2 hours later slumped over his steering wheel 10 miles out of town. "Heart attack?" Sid asked. "No," Connell whispered, his voice shaking. "He was dead, but not from natural causes. The cause of death was listed as acute neurological trauma, same as this man looks. And he didn't die alone. They found something else in the car with him. Not a person. A journal." Miles felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. What was in the journal? Connell looked from the wall to Miles, his eyes wide and panicked. "Just pages and pages of impossible sketches, Miles." But on the final page, written in his own blood, was a note. It said, "The dispatcher knows the names of the lost sirens." And right beneath the text, he drew that. Connell pointed a trembling finger at the inverted police badge on the lighthouse wall. "The rookie didn't just see the black dispatch," Miles said slowly, fitting the pieces together. "He was working for it." "No," Connell shook his head, looking utterly terrified. "He was the first siren. And you two just answered the call." The arrival of the rest of the Havenwood PD support team, a chaotic flurry of flashing blue lights, forensics vans, and uniformed confusion, did little to dispel the dread Miles and Sid felt. They were no longer investigating a crime. They were navigating the opening act of a terrifying legend come true. Sergeant Connell, shaken but recovering his military bearing, pulled Miles aside as the forensic technicians in their white suits began documenting the geometry on the wall. "Listen to me, Kincaid. This stays code 8-71. Off book. You and Sid run point." Connell's voice was low and urgent. "I'll handle the captain, but you tell him nothing about Hayes or the journal. That was buried for a reason. If this gets out, it breaks the department." "It's already broken, Rex," Miles countered, his eyes scanning the forensics team. "That thing was in the tower. And this symbol, it's not local folklore. is targeting us. The police. Exactly why we keep it quiet. Connell hissed. Hayes's death was ruled a lone incident. Bad wiring in the car, a seizure. We maintain that until we know what we're dealing with. Sid joined them, holding the tablet containing the initial report on Elias Thorne. Thorne has been transported to Havenwood General, straight to the neuro ward. The doctors are baffled. No stroke, no known toxin. Just extreme induced psychosis that overloaded his system. They're calling it a conscious shutdown. And the black drawing? Miles asked. Forensics are collecting samples, Sid replied. But preliminary analysis on the composition is weird. The majority is bitumen, roofing tar, but the black powder mixed in? They can't place it. It's got trace elements of several rare earth minerals and burnt paper. They're running a deeper spectrograph. Miles looked up at the darkened, derelict lantern room. Let's focus on the power source. That red light. Sid, get a team up there. Find out how they got power and where the bulb came from. The team spent the next hour examining the lighthouse. The discovery was unsettlingly uniform. There were no leads. The locks, though visibly destroyed, had been secured from the inside before the force was applied. There were no footprints, tire marks, or physical evidence of any conventional break-in. The only thing connecting the scene to the outside world was Thorne's elderly vehicle parked 200 yards away. Sid returned from the lantern room, her face grim. The place is a crypt, Miles. No power lines, the old generator is rusted solid, and the electrical box is missing key components. But the lens, the original Fresnel lens, it's gone. Gone? That thing weighs a ton. Exactly. It's not a smash and grab. It was removed. And in its place, just hanging by an improvised wire, was the red light source. Sid held up a small evidence bag containing what looked like a cheap industrial LED bulb, still faintly warm. It's powered by a single high-capacity, off-the-shelf battery pack. Nothing exotic. But it's drained completely. The energy output required to make that intense light for even a few minutes should have blown the battery. So the power wasn't coming from the battery, Miles deduced. It was coming from somewhere else. Miles stared at the inverted badge on the wall. The black dispatch symbol. It was a mirror image of the department's authority. Hayes the rookie, Miles said, thinking aloud. He was the first. He had the journal. That's the key. Where is that journal now, Sid? It's evidence, so it should be in the archive. No, Miles cut her off, remembering Connell's fear. Rex said it was buried. If it's buried, it's not in the regular evidence locker. It would be in the private vault beneath the precinct, the one for confidential police intelligence, controlled only by the captain and the sergeant. Miles turned to Connell, who was arguing quietly with a forensics tech. Sergeant, we need the private vault key. Now. Connell paled again. Miles, you can't just. Rex, the thing that drew that badge is linked to a cold case that killed one of your own? Miles's voice was dangerously low. We are standing in its next crime scene. Give me the key, or I will go directly to the captain and explain why you're obstructing a Code 8-71 investigation. Connell hesitated, then sighed in resignation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ornate brass key, dull with age. He pressed it into Miles's hand. The vault door is in the basement. Good luck, Anchor. But if you open that book, don't expect to close it. Back at the 14th precinct, the basement was a forgotten world of humming HVAC units and dusty storage. The private vault was hidden behind a locked maintenance door. Miles inserted the brass key into the heavy, steel door. It clicked with a muffled, mechanical finality. They stepped into a small, climate-controlled room lined with old steel shelves, holding the department's darkest secrets. Unsolved internal affairs files, sequestered case documents, and evidence too disturbing or politically sensitive for public record. Miles found the shelf quickly, tucked into the far back corner. A steel evidence box marked with the internal designation, Case 05 HPD 003, Hayes J. Officer. Confidential. He pulled out the box and placed it on a small, sterile desk in the center of the room. Sid looked over his shoulder as he opened the lid. Inside, resting on a layer of foam, was a waterlogged, leather-bound notebook. It was Officer Julian Hayes's journal. Miles carefully lifted the book. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the binding held. He began to flip through the pages. The initial entries were normal police observations. routine patrols, traffic stops. But quickly the entries began to dissolve into paranoia, anxiety, and the rambling thoughts of a man descending into terror. Then came the sketches. Not of people, but of patterns. Shifting, impossible angles, the geometric forms from the lighthouse wall, drawn over and over, meticulously and obsessively. Finally, Miles reached the last 2 pages. The penultimate page was filled with looping, near-illegible handwriting. The light is the wrong way. The dispatcher does not talk on the radio. He talks in the sound of the silence. He gives the orders for the lost patrols. The siren is calling my name. I am joining the fleet. Miles turned to the final page. It was blank, save for the drawing Connell had described, centered perfectly on the heavy cardstock. The inverted police badge, drawn with shocking precision. But above the badge, Hayes had inscribed a single crystalline drop of his own blood, which had oxidized to a dark brown stain. And beside it, written in barely visible pencil, was a single cryptic instruction. Listen for the Black 9. Miles and Sid stared at the inscription. What was the Black 9? A street? A unit? A frequency? At that moment, the lights in the vault flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness before buzzing back on. Then, from the old rusted PA speaker mounted high in the corner of the vault, an emergency broadcast speaker that hadn't been used in years, a sound erupted. It was a static-laced, low-frequency tone. Bzzz. It wasn't the regular police radio. It was a frequency lower than the human voice, a vibration that resonated not in their ears, but in the marrow of their bones. And then, a cold, synthesized voice devoid of inflection, cut through the noise, directed at no one, and yet clearly meant only for them. Black dispatch. The anchor is calling. Unit K9. Report to the pier of the Silent Watch. Miles slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dispatcher wasn't a metaphor. It was real. And it had just given him his marching orders. The message from the forgotten PA system, the Black Dispatch, was a chilling confirmation. This supernatural entity not only knew their designation, the anchor, but was actively mimicking the precinct's operational protocol to issue its own directives. Miles Kincaid grabbed the Hayes journal and the evidence box. We move now. Before anyone else hears that, or before it decides to send someone else. The pier of the Silent Watch? Sid asked, her hand resting on her sidearm as they hurried out of the basement. That's the old, condemned municipal pier past the naval yards. It's been fenced off for 15 years. Why Unit K9? Hayes wrote, listen for the Black 9, Miles reminded her, pulling the unmarked car keys from his jacket. K9. Unit 9. It's too specific to be coincidence. It wants us to intercept Unit 9. As they sped through the rainy streets back toward the coast, Miles ran the facts through his mind, trying to find a terrestrial logic. Connell buried the Hayes case. The dispatcher knows the names of the lost sirens. And now it's sending us to meet a police unit at a condemned pier. If it knows our designations, it's listening to our comms, or it has access to department records, Sid suggested, her voice tight. Either way, it means whatever this thing is, it's operating inside the 14th precinct. Or it is the precinct, Miles murmured, the thought sending a fresh wave of cold through him. A sickness in the foundation. The pier of the Silent Watch was a skeletal structure of rotting wood and rusted metal jutting 100 yards into the freezing harbor water. The fog off the ocean was thick here, a blinding, wet wall that muffled the sound of the city completely. They parked the Crown Vic discreetly behind a pile of stacked shipping containers and proceeded on foot. The air smelled strongly of brine and decaying marine life. I don't see Unit 9, Sid whispered, checking the pier with the beam of her powerful tactical flashlight. The light beam cut through the fog, revealing the treacherous, collapsing planks of the pier. The area was officially closed. The only thing moving was the heavy swell of the water beneath the wooden structure. Miles checked his watch. The dispatch was timed for right now. If Unit 9 is coming, they should be here. Suddenly, Miles caught a faint, flickering light deep within the fog, moving slowly toward them from the end of the pier. It was not a steady beam like their flashlights, but an inconsistent, oscillating flicker. There's the light, Sid pointed, raising her weapon. But it's too dim for a police cruiser. As the light drew closer, the sound of a familiar low engine rumble finally reached them, muffled and distorted by the fog. The flickering light resolved into the distinct, intermittent flash of a patrol car's emergency bar, but the color was wrong. It wasn't the standard red and blue. It was pulsing a dull, sickly yellow-green like rotting phosphorus. Miles gripped his sidearm tighter. That's Unit 9. And they're running the wrong lights. The police cruiser, an older model Ford Crown Victoria, identical to the one Miles drove, but marked with the number 9 on the side, pulled into the faint pool of light cast by the lone functional street lamp at the pier entrance. The vehicle was coated in a layer of grime and something that looked suspiciously like dried reddish mud. The driver's side window was down. Behind the wheel sat a uniformed officer. Miles and Sid approached cautiously, weapons holstered but ready. "Evening, officer," Miles said, his voice flat. "Detective Kincaid, 14th Precinct." "Who are you?" The officer in Unit 9 didn't move. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The uniform was too loose, and his face was obscured by the deep shadow cast by his patrol cap. "Sir, identify yourself," Sid commanded. Slowly, the officer turned his head to face them. It was Officer Julian Hayes. But it couldn't be. Julian Hayes had been dead for 5 years. His face was the same as the picture on his file, young, freckled, but his skin was stretched tight, a translucent, parchment-like sheen, and his eyes were disturbingly dry, fixed, and reflective. They looked less like human eyes and more like polished obsidian discs. A cold wind seemed to whip out of the car. The metallic, sweet, rotten plum smell of the black dispatch hit them full force. "You answered," the figure, the echo of Hayes, said. The voice wasn't synthesized like the dispatcher's PA message. It was flat, dusty, and sounded like sand shifting in a dry throat. "Hayes is dead," Miles stated, keeping his voice level despite the shock curdling his blood. "The dispatcher does not lose his patrol," the entity replied, its lips barely moving. "I am Unit 9, the first siren, and I am here to issue the arrest warrant." Sid instinctively raised her hand to her radio, but Miles shook his head slightly. The dispatcher was listening. "Warrant for whom?" Miles pressed, taking a slow, steady step closer to the car. "For those who refuse the true color," Unit 9 said, its head tilting slightly. "The light is red now. The light is wrong now. You saw the sign. The geometry demands order. The dispatcher needs the lens." The moment the word lens left its lips, a sharp, grinding noise emanated from the back seat of the patrol car. Miles peered through the window. The entire back seat was stacked high with piles of what looked like shredded, blackened documents. And sitting on top of the pile, glowing faintly with that sickly yellow-green light, was the massive, multifaceted Fresnel lens stolen from the lighthouse. It was resting there as if placed by a delivery man, completely incongruous with the small sedan. As they stared at the lens, the lights on the police car flashed again, faster this time, accompanied by a sound that wasn't a siren but a rhythmic, high-frequency pulse, the same thrumming they heard in the lighthouse. The eyes of the Hayes entity suddenly snapped from fixed obsidian discs to something far more horrifying. They pulsed with a dull, malevolent red, matching the light they had seen in the lantern room. "Join the fleet, Miles Kincaid. Take the dispatch," Unit 9 commanded, its dry voice rising to a frantic, mechanical crescendo. "The geometry is waiting for you in the tower. The black dispatch is calling. 9 black. 9 lost." Miles didn't wait for the next command. "Go. Go. Go." He grabbed Sid and dove backward as the engine of Unit 9 suddenly roared to life. The car didn't shift into drive. Instead, the wheels spun wildly in place, the tires tearing up the gravel, the entire vehicle shaking violently. Unit 9 then lunged forward, not toward them, but straight off the end of the pier. Miles and Sid scrambled to the crumbling edge. The yellow-green lights and the screaming, thrumming pulse disappeared instantly as the police cruiser, with the entity of Hayes and the massive Fresnel lens, plunged into the black, freezing water of the harbor. The water immediately settled, leaving no trace, no bubbles, and no sound save for the heavy, rhythmic swell of the tide. The smell of copper and plums vanished instantly, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of sea salt and mist. Miles stared at the vacant, black water. It didn't crash. It was recalled. Sid was breathing heavily, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "It called us out here. It showed us the lens. The Black 9. Wanted us to see him. And it told us that the geometry is waiting for us, back at the tower." Miles turned away from the harbor, pulling the worn Hayes journal from his pocket. He flipped it to the final page and looked at the blood drop next to the inverted badge. "It's not just calling us out, Sid," Miles said, the realization chilling him to the core. "It's building a fleet. It's using our own personnel, our own vehicles, our own code to create its own department. And Unit 9 just recruited us to go back to its base of operations. The lighthouse." The events at the pier of the Silent Watch were logged under the increasingly strained Code 8-71 report as unfounded civilian report leading to patrol car accident. Miles and Sid made no mention of Julian Hayes, the yellow-green lights, or the impossible geometry on the back seat. To the department, they were investigating a bizarre noise complaint at the lighthouse that led to a catatonic civilian, and an unrelated patrol car somehow driving itself off a condemned pier. Sergeant Connell, though outwardly furious about the paperwork and the missing cruiser, understood the gravity. He knew Kincaid and Sidney had seen something monstrous. The immediate fallout was their summons to the captain's office. Captain Eleanor Vance, a woman known for her icy composure and absolute intolerance for insubordination, sat behind a pristine mahogany desk, the very desk the Black Dispatch had used to call Miles. "Explain to me, Detective Kincaid," Vance said, her voice dangerously quiet, "why my two best detectives are spending a full night on a spooky house call, confirming a catatonic man, and subsequently costing the Havenwood PD a $50,000 patrol vehicle, a vehicle that was logged out and returned hours ago." Miles exchanged a glance with Sid. This was the new wrinkle. "Captain," Miles started, "we have documented evidence that Unit 9 was present at the pier of the Silent Watch. We saw the car and we saw the number." "The logs disagree, Detective," Vance interrupted, sliding a printout across the desk. "Unit 9 assigned to Officer Dean, checked in at 2 o'clock hours, reported no activity, and the vehicle was parked in the precinct garage at 2:05, where it remains. The car that went into the harbor was an older model, a wreck, stolen and disguised." Sid picked up the thread. "The lights, Captain. The lights on the car we saw were yellow-green, not standard red and blue. The car was coated in reddish grime and the officer driving—" She stopped herself just short of mentioning Hayes. "The officer was unresponsive." Vance leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "You are suggesting, detectives, that in the fog, under extreme stress, you witnessed a non-existent car being driven by a phantom officer, and you allowed this phantom to destroy city property?" Miles knew arguing logic was pointless. The dispatcher was not only operating outside the laws of physics but was actively manipulating the department's physical records and potentially the memories or perceptions of other officers. "Captain, we recovered this from the scene." Miles reached into the evidence box and pulled out a small water-damaged piece of fabric. A swatch of the uniform from the interior of the stolen vehicle. Vance took the fabric, her fingers brushing the stiff, faded material. It was dark blue, the color of the standard PD uniform, but it had an unnatural rigidity. "Forensics will analyze the fibers," Vance stated. "Forensics won't find anything," Miles said. "They already ran the black substance from the lighthouse. It's impossible. This dispatcher isn't using cotton and polyester. It's using something else. And the dispatcher is talking directly to us." He quickly recounted the chilling PA message in the private vault, omitting the reference to the Hayes journal. Vance's composure finally fractured. Her eyes widened momentarily, a flicker of pure fear crossing her face before she clamped down on it. "I had the basement PA system disabled years ago. That frequency is dead." "It's not dead, Captain. It's selective," Miles insisted. "It gave us an order. The anchor is calling. Report to the pier. The dispatcher knows our internal code and is using it to draw us into a pattern." Vance rose and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-swept city. "I came across the Hayes file years ago, Kincaid. The acute neurological trauma. The geometry. I buried it because I recognized the signature." She turned back to them, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't a gang, Miles. This isn't a cult. It's a structure. And it's using the department's inherent order and authority as its template for chaos. Hayes wasn't a victim, he was absorbed. He became a unit." "So you believe us," Sid said. "I believe in what I can't explain," Vance corrected, picking up the discarded uniform swatch and holding it up to the light. "I believe in the fear on Thorne's face, and the fact that two experienced detectives are risking their careers to tell me a story about a sentient lighthouse and a ghost car. She dropped the fabric back on the desk. Here is the new order. The investigation is officially closed. Case 8-71 is archived under structural collapse and mental health crisis. The pier incident is theft and vandalism. Miles started to protest. Captain, we can't stop. You won't stop, Vance interrupted, her eyes cold steel. But you will work outside the system. You are now officially off duty indefinitely. You have no resources, no backup, and no jurisdiction. If you use the department radio, it's dismissal. If you get caught, I will deny everything. She walked around the desk and stood close to Miles, her eyes piercing his. The dispatcher gave you a next order at the pier. It said, the geometry is waiting for you in the tower. It wants you to go back. It wants you to complete the pattern. I cannot stop you, but I will not sanction it. Why did the dispatcher call me the anchor? Miles asked. Vance hesitated, then offered a cryptic explanation that chilled him more than any direct threat. The anchor is what holds the line. But in the sea, the anchor is also what is pulled under when the tide changes. It either stops the drift, or it becomes the first to drown. What do we do now? Sid asked, looking at Miles. Miles picked up the Hayes journal. We go back to the lighthouse, Captain. But we don't go back as police. We go back as two citizens looking for a missing lens. Take this, Vance said, opening her desk drawer. She didn't pull out a file or a weapon. She pulled out a small metallic object, an old heavy black rotary dial. It was the receiver for a vintage payphone, but the cord was cut cleanly at the base. The only time the dispatcher communicated on a system I couldn't control was through the private line. If you find another point of contact, use this. Might shield you. Might not. It was found on Officer Hayes's corpse. Miles took the heavy piece of metal. It was cold, strangely resonant, and felt profoundly wrong in his hand. One more thing, Detective, Vance added, her voice dropping. When Hayes was found, the police scanner in his patrol car wasn't tuned to the police frequency. It was tuned to channel 6. It was just static. But they called it the wailing channel. Miles and Sid were now ghosts in their own city. They drove the unmarked Crown Vic, reappropriated under the guise of extended personal leave, back toward the coastal area, no longer relying on radios or official comms. Their only link to the Black Dispatch was the journal and the cryptic instruction to tune into the wailing channel. They stopped at a nondescript electronics store, purchasing a wideband frequency scanner, the kind used by amateur radio enthusiasts, not police. They needed to find channel 6. Back in the car, Miles powered on the new scanner, the digital display glowing brightly in the dark interior. Sid held the Hayes journal open to the final, chilling page. Connell said Hayes's car radio was tuned to channel 6, Sid noted. Police bands are usually in the 460 MHz range. Channel 6 foot could be anything. Miles began sweeping the low frequencies, starting below the standard civilian bands. The scanner spat out the usual static, interspersed with snippets of fuzzy local radio and distorted trucker chatter. It has to be a frequency that police wouldn't use, Miles muttered, focusing intently on the sweep. Something that sounds like nothing to everyone else. As he scrolled past the 148 MHz range, the scanner suddenly seized up, emitting a sharp, angry static that wasn't random noise. It was dense, controlled, and almost sounded like thousands of distant voices compressed into a single high-frequency whine. The display read, 151.605 MHz. Stop, Sid said, her voice strained. That's it. That's not static, Miles. It's talking. The noise was relentless, a vibrating wall of compressed sound that threatened to rupture their eardrums. It held no discernible words, only the rhythmic, pulsing energy that was terrifyingly familiar, the thrumming they had heard in the lighthouse and at the pier. The wailing channel, Miles confirmed, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. He picked up the heavy, cold rotary dial receiver Captain Vance had given them. It felt heavy and strangely solid. Let's see if this shield works. He held the black metal receiver up near the scanner speaker. The moment it got close, the dense static on 151.605 MHz didn't stop, but the sound seemed to shift, modulating instantly into a lower, slower frequency that was no longer painful, but deeply disturbing. They could now hear it, A low, rhythmic keening like a foghorn played underwater, overlaid with faint, distinct voices whispering in unison, voices that spoke in code, using the language of police procedure. Unit 6 reporting geometry confirmed. Loss of anchor integrity. Black dispatch is active, 3 units in formation, awaiting final signal. The patrol must not leave the dark. Sid gripped the dashboard. They're talking about us. They're monitoring the failure of the department, the loss of anchor integrity. And they're reporting to the dispatcher. This is their network, Miles said grimly. The dispatcher's radio room. And they just confirmed 3 units, Hayes Unit 9, and 2 others. The lost sirens. Miles focused on the rhythmic keening beneath the whispers. It was a precise, measured pulse like a slow, failing heartbeat. He realized it wasn't just noise, it was marking something. Listen to the tempo, Miles instructed. The pulse. It's too slow to be a heart. It's a metronome. Sid listened, counting the beats. 1, 3. It's exactly 12 seconds between each pulse. Miles nodded, pulling up a map of Havenwood on his phone. He accessed the old municipal records for the lighthouse property. The Havenwood Lighthouse's original beacon, the one before the electric conversion in the 1950s, was rated to flash once every 12 seconds. The radio wasn't just broadcasting. It was syncing its beat to the rhythm of the derelict light. Miles's focus shifted back to the whispers. A new voice, higher and faster than the others, cut through the keening pulse. Unit 4 is deployed, location designated, Harbor Master's office, Code 419 in effect. Code 419, Sid said instantly, recognizing the department code. Suspicious death. The Harbor Master's office is on the far end of the same pier where Unit 9 was recalled. The dispatcher is continuing the patrol, Miles deduced. It lost Hayes, so it sent Unit 4 to establish the next point of the geometry. And they want us to follow. Miles jammed the car into drive. The dispatcher is laying a breadcrumb trail using its own officers and our own codes. It wants us to walk the geometry. The Harbor Master's office was a small, prefabricated building situated right on the water's edge, half a mile from the pier of the Silent Watch. Despite the late hour, the office light was on, a single harsh fluorescent tube casting an unflattering, sterile glow. There was a police car parked askew near the entrance. Not a ghost car, but a standard, modern Havenwood PD cruiser, marked clearly as Unit 4. That's a real car, Miles. And that's a real officer, Sid noted, seeing the silhouette of a uniform behind the wheel. They approached with extreme caution, Miles holding the scanner and the dial receiver, close. The wailing channel was still audible, the frantic whispers now laced with expectation. Unit 4 acknowledges anchor approach, deployment confirmed. Miles peered through the passenger window of Unit 4. Behind the wheel was a young woman, patrolwoman Lena Sue, a rookie Miles vaguely recognized. She was staring straight ahead, hands on the wheel, identical to the posture of the Hayes entity. Patrolwoman Sue? Miles tapped gently on the window. Sue didn't react. She was utterly still, her face pale. Miles tried the door handle. Locked. He shone his light on her eyes. They were wide open, dilated, but they didn't have the obsidian shine of Hayes. They were simply focused on something Miles couldn't see. She's alive, but she's catatonic, just like Thorne, Sid confirmed, checking the back door. Suddenly, a rhythmic tapping sound came from inside the Harbor Master's office, where the fluorescent light was on. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like knuckles rapping on a window pane. Miles checked the wailing channel. The siren is sounding the count. Anchor must answer the siren. The siren isn't a sound, it's a person, Miles realized, drawing his weapon. Unit 4 is the next lost siren, and the dispatcher is claiming her inside. He kicked the flimsy door to the Harbor Master's office open. The office was small and tidy. Behind the desk, sitting in the Harbor Master's chair, was another uniformed officer, a man possibly in his late 20s with his back to them. He was tapping his fingers lightly on the desk, creating the rhythmic sound. This was Unit 6. Before Miles could speak, the officer turned slowly. His uniform was soaked in seawater, his face pale and slack. His eyes were not red or obsidian, but empty. He was not catatonic. He was dead. And the cause of death was instantly, horrifically clear. A long, straight cut across his throat, drawn with surgical precision. But the tapping continued. It wasn't the dead man. Miles followed the sound. The dead officer's hand was resting on a strange device on the desk. An old, metal police callbox, the kind used in the 1940s. The dial was spinning rapidly on its own, clicking the numbers in a frantic sequence. Miles looked down at the desk. The dead officer had scrawled a note in his own blood on a shipping manifest, his finger tracing the lines. It was the inverted police badge. The black dispatch. And next to the badge, a single horrifying instruction. The dispatcher calls Unit 0. The silence in the harbor master's office, after the dialing stopped and the metallic tang of blood faded into the brine, was heavy with the weight of absolute ritual. Unit 6 was dead, sacrificed precisely to deliver a single message. Unit 0. They're escalating, Miles stated, holstering his weapon and forcing himself to examine the horrific scene with professional detachment. Thorne was catatonic. Sue, Unit 4, is catatonic and immobilized. Unit 6 is dead. The cost of the dispatcher's geometry is increasing. Sid was examining the vintage callbox, careful not to touch it. Unit 0 isn't a patrol number, Miles. All our modern patrol unit numbers start at Unit 1. Unit 0 foot is either a designation from the dispatcher's original structure, maybe the very first lost siren, or it's a location. Miles pulled out the Hayes journal. Hayes wrote, "The dispatcher knows the names of the lost sirens. Let's check the old rosters. If the dispatcher is building its network using decommissioned or deceased units, Unit 0 might be a ghost from the department's past." Miles took photos of the inverted badge and the message, while Sid called Sergeant Connell on her personal, untraceable burner phone. "Sergeant, it's Sid. We need old personnel files. Specifically, the Havenwood PD roster from 1950 to 1960. Look for any officer or dispatcher who retired or disappeared under suspicious circumstances and whose unit number may have been 0 or not assigned." Connell's voice was a strained whisper over the line. "You're at the harbor master's office. I see Unit 4's transponder. You need to leave. Now, before a patrol car, a real one, finds you. We can't leave. We found another siren. Dead Rex. Throat cut like a ritual." He left a message, Unit 0. Connell was silent for a terrifyingly long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Unit 0? I've heard that name. Not on the roster. It was a joke among the old-timers, Miles. They said Unit 0 was the one who never left the station. The one who answered all the lost calls. The dispatcher," Miles realized. "Unit 0 isn't a victim, it's the role. Look, I'll get the files, but you need to get back to the precinct. Vance is already twitchy. Do not engage with Unit 4, Miles. She's gone. You just bought yourselves another casualty." Connell hung up before Miles could argue. Miles and Sid drove back toward the precinct, but instead of entering, they parked several blocks away in the industrial district. They were using a back alley diner for a makeshift command post, waiting for Connell to send the files. Miles scanned the wailing channel. The whispers were more frantic now, laced with static and triumph. "Unit 0 is active. Anchor has the message. Unit 0 is confirmed at the Heart of the Watch." "Heart of the Watch?" Sid repeated, tapping a pen on the old map of Havenwood. "The city seal says Havenwood, the watch on the coast. The Heart of the Watch, that's the police department itself. The 14th precinct. The dispatcher is calling its command center Unit 0, Miles concluded. It's sending the entire patrol back to the station. Unit 9, Unit 4, Unit 6. All these geometric points are leading us to the place where the whole thing started, our own precinct." Suddenly, Miles's burner phone buzzed, a file transfer notification from Connell. The files were heavily redacted scans of old, brittle personnel records from the 1950s. Most were legible. One file, however, was almost completely blacked out, labeled simply, "Dispatcher, inactive." Miles zoomed in on the scant remaining details of the dispatcher file. Name, Elias V. Roth. Position, Head Watch Dispatcher, 14th Precinct. Unit designation, not applicable, internal reference only, Z0. Date of disappearance, October 31, 1957. Notes, observed unusual fixation on internal codes and geometric patterns. Final log entry read, "The watch is turning inward. The light must be inverted to see the truth. Body never recovered. Case ruled a non-jurisdictional vanishing. Elias V. Roth. Disappeared on Halloween 1957. The dispatcher is a person or was a person, Sid whispered, pointing to the note. The inverted light, the inverted badge. It's all connected to this man. And his internal reference was Z0 or Unit 0, Miles added, his mind racing. The dispatcher is Roth. He's been operating this black dispatch for over 60 years, claiming officers and vehicles. Suddenly the new scanner screamed, not the controlled keening of the wailing channel, but a sound like pure raw electrical feedback. It forced Miles to tear the rotary dial receiver away from the speaker. A new voice, deeper and louder than the whispers, cut through the noise, shattering the previous pattern. This voice was synthesized like the one from the vault, but laced with a terrifying, absolute authority. Black Dispatch. Unit K9 is calling. Code 11 to 44 confirmed. The heart of the watch requires an immediate presence. Miles and Sid froze. Code 11 to 44. Death in the family. The dispatcher is calling in a major incident, Sid breathed. It's forcing the situation. No, Miles shook his head, looking at the name Roth and the date 1957. It's calling in us. We are the family it's referring to. And it wants us in the building. Miles stood up, throwing a few bills on the table. We know what Unit 0 is and we know the location. The 14th precinct is the dispatcher's lair. We go in now. We find the source of the wailing channel and we shut down the transmission. As they hurried back to the car, Miles felt the cold, heavy weight of the old rotary dial in his pocket. He looked at the old Ford Crown Vic that was now their only asset, its windows reflecting the dark, empty street. If the dispatcher is Elias Roth, an old officer who vanished in the station, Miles said, pulling out his pistol and checking the magazine, then the source of the broadcast won't be in the radio room. It'll be somewhere Roth could still be working years after he disappeared. Sid nodded, her eyes wide with grim understanding. The dispatcher's desk, Miles. We're going to find where Unit 0 still answers the lost calls. The 14th Precinct Station House was a fortress of grim, mid-century modern architecture. Miles and Sid approached from the back entrance, the one used by maintenance staff and late-shift detectives, around 3:30 a.m. They were off-book, and the only unit they intended to meet was Unit 0. The patrol garage was dimly lit, smelling of stale coffee and exhaust fumes. Miles quickly scanned the cars. Unit 9 was, according to department records, safely parked in its spot. But as Miles shone his tactical light on the vehicle, he noticed the subtle, disturbing difference. The front grille was slightly warped, and the interior smelled faintly of brine despite being dry. The dispatcher was using the memory of the vehicles, not just the physical objects. They moved silently through the deserted hallways. The main dispatch room, the heart of the modern 911 response, was on the second floor, a brightly lit room filled with banks of computers and modern radio equipment. Miles steered them away from it. Roth disappeared in 1957. He used a physical patchboard and dedicated lines, not digital radio. The wailing channel is old school. We're looking for the original nerve center. They descended into the sub-basement, an area even deeper than the private vault, mostly used for long-term storage and antiquated utility systems. The air here was colder, smelling of concrete dust and slow decay. Miles used the detailed blueprints from Connell's old files. Roth's original dispatch center wasn't in the main room. It was a dedicated, reinforced booth, built during the post-war communication boom. It was supposedly decommissioned and walled off in the late 60s. They found it hidden behind a stack of rusted boiler pipes and decommissioned air ducts. It was a section of concrete wall that looked marginally newer, but the faint outline of a heavy framed doorway was visible beneath layers of peeling paint. The dispatcher didn't just disappear, Sid whispered, running a gloved hand over the concrete. He was sealed in. Miles grabbed a heavy pry bar they'd brought from the garage and began systematically forcing the brittle mortar around the old frame. It took 5 minutes of brutal, noisy effort, the only saving grace being the thick concrete walls that muffled the sound from the rest of the precinct. With a final, desperate heave, the old door frame gave way. They shone their lights into the gap. The room was small, square, and utterly preserved by the decades of isolation. It was the original dispatcher's booth. In the center sat a long, heavy wooden desk, still covered in dust. On the desk was the main tool of the 1950s dispatcher, a massive gray metal patchboard filled with hundreds of ports and physical wires for connecting police cars and call boxes. And on the chair facing the patchboard was a skeleton. It was Elias Roth, Unit 0. The skeleton was slumped forward, its dusty, decades-old uniform threadbare. The collarbones were stained a deep, unsettling red. But it wasn't the skeleton that drew their focus, it was the patchboard. Every single port on the patchboard was glowing with a faint, pulsing red light, the same light they had seen in the lighthouse. And from the center of the panel, where the main trunk line connected, a sound was emanating, the low, 12-second rhythmic keening of the wailing channel. He never left, Miles breathed. Roth died here, physically tied to his work. But the dispatcher became Unit 0. He converted the entire communication system into his geometry. Sid pointed to the skeleton's hand. The bones of the finger were curled around a pencil, which rested on a heavy logbook, frozen in the act of writing. Miles carefully stepped around the desk, his gaze fixed on the glowing patchboard. The pulse of the red lights was accelerating. He reached the logbook. The final, incomplete entry, written over 60 years ago, was almost identical to the scratchings of the recent victims. Log date, October 31st, 57. Shift end, not applicable. Lost the light. It's too bright outside. Must invert the signal. All calls must be filtered through Z0. Geometry is stabilizing. Need the anchor to hold the line. Suddenly, the red pulse on the patchboard intensified. The whispers on the wailing channel, faint from the patchboard, escalated into a frantic, collective shriek. Anchor is within the heart. Unit 0 is active. Initiating code 11 to 44. Loss of the dispatcher requires replacement. The lights in the entire precinct, miles away in the modern offices above them, flickered violently. A massive, resonant thrumming shook the concrete floor of the sub-basement. Miles realized the implication of the final log entry and the dispatcher's current goal. Roth was Unit 0, the dispatcher. He needed a replacement, the new anchor, to take his place and maintain the geometry of the black dispatch. A single thick copper cable, blackened with age, suddenly detached itself from a port near the center of the patchboard. It whipped out like a snake, coiling back on itself before pointing directly at Miles. The end of the cable, exposed and bare, began to glow with the intense, sick red light. It was looking for its anchor point. The line is active, Miles. Sid screamed, pulling her weapon. It's trying to connect you to the geometry. Miles reacted instantly, pulling the heavy, black rotary dial receiver from his pocket. He didn't know if Vance was right about it being a shield, but it was the only piece of the old system he possessed. He slammed the rotary dial onto the glowing, exposed end of the copper cable. The connection was immediate and violent. A blast of pure, raw, white light erupted, followed by an agonizing shriek of feedback that overloaded the wailing channel, muffling all sound. Miles felt a massive electrical surge shoot up his arm, but the dial receiver, the piece of Unit 0's own network, somehow channeled the energy, preventing it from consuming him. The cable didn't burn him, it adhered to the dial, the two pieces of old communication hardware locking together. Through the white light and the deafening noise, Miles heard a final, crystalline voice cut through the sound. Unit 0. Reconnected. The anchor has the dispatch. Final command, the light of the siren must be extinguished. The light and the sound vanished instantly. The red glow on the patchboard died. The keening of the wailing channel went silent. Elias Roth's skeleton slumped further. Miles was left standing in the silent, dusty booth, his hand gripping the rotary dial, which was now fused to the copper cable. He was alive, but the dispatcher's final command echoed in his skull. The light of the siren, Sid said, her voice hoarse from the noise. He's not talking about the lighthouse, Miles. He's talking about the officer. Miles looked at the logbook, then back at the silent, decommissioned patchboard. He's talking about Patrolwoman Sue. Unit 4. She's the next siren he needs to complete his fleet. And he just gave me the order to execute her. Miles stood in the chilling silence of Unit 0's forgotten booth, the heavy fused cable and rotary dial receiver now an extension of his own arm. He was the anchor, connected to the black dispatch's geometry, but resisting its pull. The dispatcher's final order, to extinguish the light of Unit 4, Patrolwoman Sue, was a terrifying test of loyalty. "The dispatcher wants me to commit murder," Miles stated, his voice flat. "It wants me to finish the work of Unit 6. It's forcing me to choose between protecting the department and protecting its geometry." Sid was already pulling them out of the booth, covering their tracks with the debris they had moved. "If we go after Sue, we fall right into his geometry, Miles. He completes his pattern, and you become the final siren. If we don't go, the dispatcher will use another means to extinguish the light," Miles countered, running a hand over his face. "If Sue is still alive, the dispatcher has her on a short fuse. She's its next sacrifice, but if I intervene, I might be able to pull her out of the pattern before she's claimed completely." Miles knew the immediate danger wasn't the dispatcher itself, but the consequences of his new, forced connection. The rotary dial receiver in his hand began to vibrate slightly, a subtle, cold thrumming. "The connection is still live," Sid observed, watching the dial. "He's watching you, waiting for you to follow the order." "Then we follow it, but we change the meaning," Miles decided. "We go to Unit 4. But we don't extinguish her light, we cut her connection." They left the precinct, heading back toward the industrial district where they had last seen patrolwoman Sue's Unit 4 cruiser. As they drove, Miles's focus was entirely on the rotary dial in his hand. The intermittent vibration was an internal compass, guiding him, pulling him. The drive was quiet until they passed the edge of the official city limits. The dial in Miles's hand suddenly started emitting a faint, high-pitched chirp, a sound distinct from the earlier wailing channel. Miles pulled over. He's trying to communicate again. But it's not the radio frequency. Sid grabbed the scanner and quickly swept the radio bands. Nothing. Miles realized where the sound was coming from. He held the dial close to his own ear. The chirping was coming from the earpiece of the old receiver, amplified by the connection to the copper wire. He heard a voice, not the synthesized tone of the dispatcher but a real voice, muffled, terrified, and laced with static. "Detective Kincaid, if you can hear me, this is Thorne. Elias Thorne, from the hospital." Elias Thorne, the catatonic civilian from the lighthouse. "Thorne, it's Kincaid. How are you speaking?" "You're catatonic. The geometry is the voice, Anchor. The geometry is the voice. When you touched the dial, you opened a line, a lost line. I am inside the geometry now, with the other sirens." Thorne's voice was fading in and out, replaced by the whispering collective of the wailing channel. "The dispatcher, he forces us to watch Unit 4. Lena Sue. The geometry is forming around her. The light is turning red. She has the key to the final unit. Unit 7. Sid leaned close. "Unit 7? We've heard of Unit 9, 4, 6, and 0. What is Unit 7? The dispatcher needs the lens, the light. Sue has the key to the lens case. The dispatcher will take her when the light turns red. He's waiting for the hour of the 7th tide. Kincaid, you have to break the line before the tide turns." The voices dissolved back into the urgent, deafening whispers of the wailing channel. The line was cut. The dispatcher had closed the communication loop. Miles slammed his fist on the dashboard. "The hour of the 7th tide. On the coast, that's high tide, the peak gravitational pull. It's due to hit exactly at 5 a.m. We have less than an hour. And Sue has a key to the lens case," Sid emphasized. "The Fresnel lens we saw in the ghost car. It's evidence, Miles. Where would the department put a critical multi-ton lens for storage? Not in the standard evidence room," Miles reasoned. "It's too big, too valuable, and too central to the dispatcher's operation. It would be secured off-site. The Havenwood Historical Archives, maybe." "We go to Sue first," Sid insisted. "We have to get the key and break the geometry before 5 a.m. They reached the harbor master's office again. Unit 4, patrolwoman Sue's cruiser, was exactly where they had left it, the officer still frozen catatonically behind the wheel. Miles approached the car, the rotary dial vibrating violently in his hand, humming with the dispatcher's impatience. He could feel the pressure of the geometry, the pressure to complete the pattern and silence the siren. He pressed the dial receiver against the door handle of Unit 4. The metal sizzled with cold. A massive surge of energy erupted, causing the car's emergency bar to flare a dazzling retina-searing red. The air filled with the coppery, plum-sweet scent of the dispatcher. "Anchor is compromising the geometry. Do not disobey the final dispatch." "Extinguish the light. Extinguish the light," the synthesized voice screamed through the metal. "Sid, the door," Miles yelled, pulling back as the car began to violently shake, the frame shuddering as if an immense, unseen force was trying to tear the metal apart. Sid slammed the pry bar hard between the door and the frame, cracking the seal. With a final agonizing wrench, the door popped open. The stench of the dispatcher was overwhelming. Patrolwoman Sue's head was slumped to the side, but her eyes were still open, fixed. A thin, dark liquid was beginning to leak from the corner of her lips. Miles shoved the rotary dial onto her duty belt, right next to her police radio, creating a physical bridge between the dispatcher's ancient line and her modern comms. A deafening roar erupted. The red light on the emergency bar short-circuited and went dark. The car stopped shaking. The metallic smell vanished. Sue slumped fully unconscious. Miles quickly checked her pulse. Faint but steady. Sid immediately began searching Sue's pockets, her hands working fast. In the bottom of her gear bag she found it, a single heavy brass key, attached to a tag with embossed lettering. "Miles, I have it," Sid whispered, handing him the key. The tag read, "HPD Evidence Annex Unit 7. Lens." "Unit 7, Miles confirmed, gripping the key. The location of the final siren's light. The dispatcher needed the key to access the lens at the hour of the 7th tide. He looked back at the patrol car, where the rotary dial and the copper cable lay fused to the duty belt. The line was silent. He had cut the connection, but not before confirming the final destination. "Unit 4 is safe. Now we go to Unit 7. The evidence annex," Miles said, his eyes hard. "We have the key." We stopped the dispatcher from completing the geometry. The Havenwood Police Department's evidence annex, Unit 7, was not an imposing fortress but a bland, low-slung warehouse nestled deep in the city's industrial park, far from the precinct's main structure. It was designed to be discreet, secure, and easily forgotten. They reached it just before 4:30 a.m. The annex was protected by standard, modern electronic security, but the heavy brass key Miles held, the key patrolwoman Sue had guarded, was clearly for an older, internal lock. "The dispatcher has the codes for the modern system," Sid noted, examining the heavy, steel side door. "But it knew the most valuable item would be secured physically, using a mechanism only an old officer or dispatcher would know." Miles found the corresponding keyhole hidden beneath a false utility panel, a heavy, brass-lined lock that had clearly been sealed for decades. He inserted the key and twisted. The heavy bolt slid back with a loud, metallic clunk. The moment the lock opened, the air around the annex thickened, and the coppery, sweet scent of the black dispatch reappeared, stronger than ever. The rotary dial, still fused to the copper wire, began to vibrate violently in Miles's hand. "Anchor is breaching the final defense. The geometry is complete. Unit 0 awaits the convergence." The synthesized voice screamed through the metal and into Miles's mind, overriding the sounds of the night. "He knows we're here," Miles shouted over the noise. "He's making his move now. Get ready." They slipped inside. The annex interior was vast, cold, and lit by sparse fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. Aisles of towering metal shelves held decades of criminal evidence. Plastic-wrapped vehicles, cardboard boxes, and sealed containers. Miles followed the pull of the rotary dial, which acted like a divining rod, leading him deeper into the maze of evidence. The vibration intensified until they reached a dedicated, climate-controlled vault at the rear of the warehouse. This vault was not for regular evidence, it was for artifacts. The door was heavy steel, sealed with a circular manual lock, but it stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. The dispatcher didn't need the key, Sid realized, pulling out her weapon. He needed the key to bring us here. He did the heavy lifting himself. Miles shoved the door open. The vault was a single large chamber, illuminated by an unbearable high-intensity red light that filled the entire space. In the center of the vault stood the Fresnel lens. It was magnificent and terrifying, a massive 6-foot-tall assembly of polished glass and bronze, suspended within a steel frame. It wasn't the lens itself that was terrifying but what was happening to it. The lens was mounted on a temporary stand, and the red light was emanating from its core. The light was being funneled and focused by the interlocking prisms of the glass, concentrating the energy into a single blinding crimson beam aimed directly at the opposite wall. And on the wall, basking in the intense red light, the geometry was complete. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was a massive, shifting, three-dimensional tapestry of the black, oily substance, non-Euclidean shapes that pulsed with their own internal light. The geometry wasn't just on the wall, it seemed to be pulling the very concrete inward, creating a vortex of impossible angles. And in the center of the vortex, illuminated by the focused red beam, was a newly formed, horrifying unit. It was a mannequin-like effigy, a tall, impossibly thin figure wearing a dark blue ancient police uniform, its head tilted in the same impossible angle as the entity Miles saw on the stairs. This was the fully manifested black dispatcher. The geometry is feeding on the light, Miles yelled over the mounting thrumming noise. It's using the lens to focus its power and finalize its form. Suddenly, the dispatcher figure began to move, stepping slowly down from the wall, its joints clicking like dry bone. It raised a long skeletal arm, pointing a stiff finger at Miles. The anchor is present, the synthesized voice echoed from the figure, filling the room with dread. The watch is inverted. Join Unit 0, Miles Kincaid. Take your place. Before they could react, a third figure materialized in the red light, Sergeant Rex Connell. He was standing near the vault entrance, his eyes wide with a manic terror, clutching a shotgun. "I won't let you, Miles," Connell screamed, his voice strained and breaking. "I buried the geometry once. I won't let you finish it. If you take the dispatch, the line will be complete." Connell didn't aim at the dispatcher. He aimed the shotgun directly at the Fresnel lens. "Rex no," Miles yelled. "If you destroy the lens, you scatter the geometry, but you'll kill yourself." "I am the second anchor," Connell screamed, tears streaming down his face. "I was there when Hayes was found. I am the one who buried the truth. I am the only one who can stop this." Connell fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space. The lead shot didn't shatter the thick glass of the lens. It struck the heavy bronze mechanism that held the light source. The temporary stand buckled, the electrical wire connecting the light source snapped, and the entire massive lens assembly toppled sideways with an agonizing groan. The red light vanished. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the terrifying geometry on the wall began to shriek, dissolving into a black, oily rain. The figure of the black dispatcher shrieked, a high, unnatural sound of pure defeat, and collapsed instantly into a pile of dusty uniform and hardened bitumen. When the emergency lights flickered on, the annex vault was quiet. The air was clean, the smell of copper and plums gone. Sergeant Connell was slumped against the wall, the shotgun falling from his grasp, his chest heaving. He was not physically injured, but his face was chalk white, his eyes hollowed with complete exhaustion and horror. Miles rushed to Connell. "Rex, what did you mean, the second anchor?" Connell coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The dispatcher. He tried to recruit me when I buried Hayes's case. I felt the pull. I resisted the geometry. I became the second anchor, fighting it from the inside, but I couldn't hold the line forever." Miles looked at the shattered Fresnel lens. The physical geometry was broken. The black dispatch was defeated, at least for now. "The dispatch is over," Miles said, looking down at the rotary dial in his hand, which was now cold and utterly silent. "We broke the geometry." The official police report on the evidence annex was another masterwork of obfuscation. Connell's actions were attributed to a stress-induced psychotic episode, triggered by the pressure of the previous night's events. The massive Fresnel lens was listed as destroyed by unauthorized discharge of a firearm, the dispatcher's effigy dismissed as hardened bitumen residue from a faulty HVAC system. Captain Vance oversaw the cleanup with ruthless efficiency. Elias Thorne and patrolwoman Sue were still catatonic, but medically stable, having been removed from the dispatcher's geometry. Unit SIXS murder was quietly shifted to a cold case file, attributed to a rival crime syndicate. Miles and Sid were reinstated, but they were fundamentally changed. They were the only ones who knew the truth. The dispatcher was gone, but the geometry still existed, broken, scattered, but waiting. A week later, Miles and Sid were in the basement of the precinct, packing up the files related to the black dispatch. Miles still kept the fused rotary dial and copper cable, his link to the geometry, in a locked box at home. Connell resigned, citing health issues, Sid said, closing the Hayes file. "He's gone to ground." "And Vance?" "She hasn't mentioned the black dispatch since." Vance knows it's not over, Miles said, looking up at the spot where the old dispatcher booth had been sealed. The wall was patched, painted, and utterly silent. Roth was the dispatcher for 60 years. That kind of pattern doesn't just evaporate. It scatters. Suddenly, the phone on the basement utility desk rang, a standard, mundane BRR. Miles picked it up. Kincaid. The voice on the other end was dispatcher Elena Velez, back on her regular shift. Her voice was clear, professional, and slightly strained. "Detective, we have a code 8 to 71. Priority 1. Off book." Miles felt a cold pit form in his stomach. Location Elena? The caller is a civilian named Thorne. Elias Thorne. He didn't use 911. He used the emergency line directly connected to the captain's private office. Sid's head snapped up. Thorne is still catatonic, Miles. He can't call. What did he say, Elena? Miles demanded, his eyes fixed on Sid's worried face. Velez paused, her voice shaking slightly. He said, "Detective," he said, "the geometry is reforming. The watch needs a new color. The dispatcher is calling for a replacement anchor." And then the line cut. "Velez," Miles said, his voice a low growl. "Is there a specific location?" "Yes, sir." He gave an address. A new one. The Havenwood Central Signal Tower. The signal tower was the city's highest point, home to all modern radio and police communications equipment. Miles hung up the phone. The dispatcher hadn't reformed the old geometry, it had adapted. "It knows Thorne is inside the geometry, Miles," Sid said, her hand reaching for her holster. "He's trapped in the network, and the dispatcher is using him as a relay. It's not using the lighthouse or the pier anymore," Miles said, grabbing his jacket. "It's going straight for the highest power source. It's trying to hijack the entire city's communication grid and convert it into the new geometry." Miles looked at the sealed wall of the old dispatcher booth, then at the modern phone he had just used. "The black dispatch didn't disappear, Sid. It migrated. And it's calling for me to face it where it can command every siren in the city." Miles and Sid drove to the Havenwood Central Signal Tower, a massive steel monolith bristling with antennae, looming over the city. It was the highest structure for 50 miles, the true heart of the watch in the modern era. They bypassed security, using their old badge numbers and the implicit authority of the code 8 to 71. The main equipment room at the top of the tower was a cacophony of humming servers and flashing lights. Miles quickly located the main police radio transmitter, a powerful multi-band unit that broadcast to every patrol car in Havenwood. The police frequency was broadcasting normally, but Miles immediately spotted the disturbance. The transmitter was running an unauthorized secondary line, a single thick cable leading down into the floor. And the equipment was radiating the familiar scent of copper and plums. "The geometry isn't here yet," Miles said, his gaze fixed on the cable. "But the dispatcher is running its line up to the city's nervous system. It's trying to establish the whaling channel on a scale that will affect millions." Sid pointed to a small, heavy black box mounted near the main power bus. "That's the source of the geometry, Miles. It's a signal amplifier, military grade. But look at the casing." The amplifier casing wasn't metal. It was covered in the same hard, black, geometric substance they had seen in the lighthouse. The box was pulsing with a faint, internal red light. Miles felt the rotary dial in his pocket vibrate fiercely, pulling him toward the amplifier. This was the final unit, the new Unit 0. Suddenly, the lights in the room dimmed, and the low rhythmic keening of the whaling channel blasted from the main speakers, amplified to a shattering volume. The dispatcher's voice cut through the noise, synthesized and absolute. "Unit 0 is active. The geometry is fixed. The anchor must join the final dispatch." Miles pulled out the rotary dial, the fused cable dangling. "The dispatcher wants me to touch the amplifier, Sid. It wants me to complete the circuit and become the new Elias Roth. If you touch it, it wins," Sid warned, pulling out a set of specialized bolt cutters. "We don't need to join, we need to sever the line." Miles nodded, but his eyes were on the main transmitter. "Severing the line will only delay it. It will scatter and then find another tower. The dispatcher's power is the geometry, and the geometry is Roth's unresolved obsession with the watch. We have to break the obsession." He looked at the black amplifier, then at the massive power bus running into the wall. "The dispatcher is using the signal tower's power to make the geometry real. I have to overload the line. He aimed his pistol at the black box. Sid, I'm going to shoot the amplifier. That will sever the physical link. You need to hit the main power bus. Overload the geometry with so much raw energy that it burns itself out. It will black out the city's comms. And keep the black dispatch from turning Havenwood into its graveyard. Miles fired. The round hit the black amplifier. The geometric substance shattered like ceramic, revealing a glowing red crystal pulsating at its core. The dispatcher shrieked, a sound of pure agony that resonated from every speaker in the tower. Sid slammed the bolt cutters onto the thick, sheath power bus cable. Sparks rained down. Miles didn't hesitate. He took the rotary dial and slammed the end of the copper cable directly onto the shattered, exposed red crystal. The surge was beyond anything he had ever experienced. The dispatcher's shriek turned into an intense, electrical roar. White light consumed the room. Miles felt his consciousness pull, the dispatcher's geometry demanding his submission, demanding he become Unit Zero. In the flash, he saw a final vision, the inverted police badge spinning rapidly, dissolving into a million shimmering particles. Elias Roth's face, pale and distorted, screamed, "The watch is forever." Then a sound cut through the chaos, the voice of Elias Thorne trapped inside the geometry, now clear and triumphant. "The anchor is strong. The light is broken." With a deafening crack, the power bus exploded. Miles felt himself thrown backward, hitting the floor hard. The white light vanished. The keening sound stopped. The scent of copper was replaced by the acrid smell of burnt ozone. The signal tower was silent. Miles sat up, his ears ringing. Sid was beside him, unconscious but breathing. The black amplifier box was vaporized. The main power bus was a mess of sparking, melted metal. Miles looked down at his hand. The rotary dial and the copper cable were gone, reduced to ash. The geometry was gone. The black dispatch had been burned out of the city's network. Miles and Sid walked out of the signal tower as the first hints of dawn broke over Havenwood. The city was quiet, its radio waves now running clean and clear. They never spoke of the black dispatch again, but they knew the geometry existed. It was not a ghost, it was a pattern. Weeks later, the city recovered. Patrolwoman Sue and Elias Thorne finally woke up, traumatized but free. Miles and Sid sat in their unmarked car, watching the morning traffic. The precinct was calm. Miles reached for the car radio to check the traffic report. He turned the dial.